所以你才会遇到这种事情。
Hey everybody, welcome to Workforce Gaming. I'm Brad, here with Doug.
Hey.
Doug recently played through, I feel like a smaller indie game, but it got a whole lot of press for
Yeah.
a variety of reasons
Sure.
that we can get into or not. But that's Devotion, which I just know it's some weird horror game that had some kind of controversial things around it. And that's really all I know about it. So I don't know if there's like more of a reason that you dug into this or if it was just something that you stumbled into.
Yeah. So well, I mean, I guess the first time I had heard about it was the controversy. So the controversy is pretty simple. The game is a game by Taiwanese developers, which is fun, and we'll talk a little bit why that's fun in a little bit. But they had a joke, and I even saw the thing. It's a kind of sort of joke. As like an Easter egg about the Chinese prime minister. So then this game just got nuked from the internet. They were going to release it on Good Old Games like recently, and then even Good Old Games said they weren't going to do it. So they ended up releasing it independently, which is when I finally got to play it. So I'll admit, like, that was also the first time I'd heard about it. But as I was kind of digging into articles about it, a lot of people are saying it's like, oh, it's a damn shame because it's actually a very good game. And it's really funny because Red Candle Games, they'd done another game before this, which I haven't played, called Detention, which is also a horror game. And then this was going to be their big, like, not AAA is not the right word, but like this was going to be their big breakout game. So like the budget was like really big. It feels big. It's a small game, but it feels like they really nailed the tone and the graphics and all that stuff. It feels like it's a very good feeling, feels like a high budget game with like really good graphics and that sort of thing. So this is going to be the game to like put them on the map, and then it just got nuked from orbit. But yeah, so I mean, it's really, really, really good. And that's the thing I kept hearing. It's like Silent Hill and best horror games of all time and that sort of thing. And that's kind of what got me interested in playing it.
So you said Silent Hill. Is it more in that line of like slow moving, just kind of wandering type horror game, or?
Yeah, so I mean, the really basic mechanics is I'd even have a hard time like pressing this as like a traditional video game, because there's puzzles kind of, but it's really you're just kind of like hearing the story. I'd almost like make it more akin to like a visual novel, I guess. Okay. Maybe. But the gameplay is very similar to, like, I guess you'd say like a walking simulator. You walk around an environment, story is told at you, and like you find items in one room and then you put them in a place that's kind of obvious. It's like, I should put these shoes over here where the other shoes are, and then something happens, kind of thing. So the gameplay is like really simple. It's like a first person view, picking up items, putting them in other places, and then watching a story and all these really cool visuals unfold as you do that.
Is it jump scare horror, or like just because you said like you put the shoes and then something happens, or is it like horror in the sense of like this is just kind of eerie and freaky?
It's definitely got definitely got like an eerie tone. There are jump scares, but I would say like the jump scares are like kind of like the worst part about it, because their setting is so cool, and the sort of just being in the place they put you in is like really just freaky. It's like it has a lot of really good atmosphere that it's in and of itself is scary. So when a jump scare comes, I kind of feel like, oh, come on guys, like you were good, just not. You didn't have to scream with the camera. Like you already had like a very creepy thing happening. You didn't need to go boo.
You're better than this.
It does. Yeah, it's funny. It feels like it almost like kind of cheapens the experience. So there are jump scares, but like that's obviously like not the part that's like super interesting. I guess we should talk a little bit about kind of the context of this game. And one of the reasons why I said, oh, it's interesting, these are Taiwanese developers. So the game is set in the 1980s. You play the father of a family, and you basically see this family's story through like three different time periods. There's the period before your daughter's born, the period just as your daughter's born, and then the period just as your daughter's like maybe 10 years old or something like that. Okay. And you are a unsuccessful screenwriter, and your wife is she was like an actress who's kind of like, because she got pregnant, she's like, okay, I'm going to stay home and stay with my kid. And it's basically the tension of the father not living up the expectations because his screenplays aren't doing well. This mom who had like give up her career of being an actress, and then this daughter who's trying to live up to both their expectations. And the thing that I really liked about it, I think more so than like pretty much any other horror game I've played, is that while the visuals are trippy, there's some really awesome visuals, some really crazy scenes, especially near the end. The story it actually tells isn't supernatural. So it's just like it's you the main story of them of like their issues and that sort of thing. You're sort of like seeing a visualization of that. So for example, like if you're seeing there's a part, kind of spoilers, where you are hearing the parents fight and they kind of like they do this kind of like weird visual thing where you see people like yelling on the screen, and then like you have to kind of calm yourself down from that. So think of that sort of like that emotion of being in an argument, that emotion of not living up to these expectations, the emotion of this, and then they visualize it. So and like the whole game actually takes place in one apartment. You're going into the apartment and leaving the apartment, but the apartment is in like 3 separate time periods. So like you'll see what the apartment is like 1980. You'll see the apartment is in 1984 and what it is in like 1986. Or I got those dates completely wrong. I know.
So where does the horror come in? Because this just sounds like your normal like kind of, not to generalize, but I feel like that's kind of your typical like indie type of story where you're kind of seeing these different characters play out and play back and forth. So how does this horror element play into it then?
So the horror element is like basically the apartment. It's very PT-ish, I guess is the best way to describe it. So like when you're in the apartment, there's like one of the things they do, the kind of cool things with like a doll, like they have like these sort of doll figures, like the mother and father. And if you're like, so there's a scene where, you know, there's dolls, you kind of turn away and then you turn back and they've moved. They do a lot of cool stuff with it. Like when you're in the apartment, like as soon as you're like facing away from camera, you turn back, something's changed. So there's no load times. You don't really see a hitch in the load. Cause I always feel like sometimes these horror games, they're trying to do something like that. There's like a hitch in the load. It's like, I better not turn around. Something's going to be there. But it's just like casually going through this very small apartment. And as you're turning and like picking up items, as you're turning and picking up items, it's changing behind you. The thing that I think some of the cool horror elements that I think is like kind of makes this game a little bit more unique than other ones is I think we're so steeped in horror games from American and Japanese developers that some of the, I think especially with some of the Japanese stuff I think I've played like recently, that you don't realize like how specifically Japanese it is. You just see it a lot. Like after playing a lot of games, like think about like Okami and stuff. There's a lot of like Japanese mythology stuff, but that Japanese mythology kind of runs through a lot of Japanese games. So you're used to seeing sort of like Shinto related creatures and that sort of imagery, and maybe like a rabbit in the moon and that kind of thing, at least that basic stuff. The thing that was cool is playing this from a Taiwanese developer is they use that sort of imagery, but it's Taiwanese. So I had no context for it. And one of the big things that they kind of touch on a little bit that I don't want to get too spoiler with the stuff is this this aspect of that they had just actually read an interview from the developer, because after I finished the game I was like, I need to read up on some of this imagery stuff, like why they're going certain ways. Is one of the things that they had mentioned that they were trying to push on in the game is that there's a certain period in Taiwanese culture when there was a lot of people who were basically, it was like in the height of the 1980s. The reason they had said it there is because there's this boon in jobs where basically like everybody needs to start work. And if like there's this idea that if you are, as long as you're working hard, then you're doing well. And the only reason you're not doing well is you're not working hard. So people who were working hard and not doing well would go to fortune tellers, and they would go to I guess sort of like mystics and that sort of thing. And the game ties in specifically to that sort of that culture of like ripping people off who go to those sort of people. And it's really interesting. And they do so they kind of mix in some of that that sort of occult aspect and the gods that those sort of people were trying to get people to like worship, when like, oh, you're not doing so bad, just worship this god kind of thing. And it ties in later and stuff into the story. But it's really cool kind of seeing this sort of imagery where I was like, I had no context for it. So it felt much different than I guess like other horror games. Like if I played 100 Chinese games, like, oh, okay, yeah, that's very clearly that snake obviously is, you know, in a lot of Chinese mythology. But this one I just didn't have that context for it. So it was just a really unique experience in that aspect as well. That it was weird playing a AAA game from a Chinese developer and seeing this sort of stuff.
Yeah, I think that's one of those things that slowly, as game development kind of spreads worldwide, that you're seeing more of, where it's like you see like stories around this culture, but not from that culture. And it's a completely different point of view of like, okay, this is an American developer, a Japanese developer in telling a story from this area, but then you always have that background of my background is an American horror, an American mythology, an American folklore. I'm just kind of interpreting this story I heard once.
Exactly.
So I think that's an interesting idea to be able to kind of actually see somebody from that area go, okay, without all that baggage of American, Japanese being obviously the two big ones, game development, and kind of put that in there is kind of an interesting thing to even think about that I feel like would kind of go missed in a lot of things.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Like one of the things that they really want to push, like when the Taiwanese players were playing it, is that the apartment they want to do is have a very typical 1980s apartment, and like there's TV shows and stuff that's like very typically
cool.
1980s. But they wanted people who were playing it who were Taiwanese to get a sense of nostalgia for it, which is similar to like other horror games. When you think of like American horror games or even Japanese ones who are doing American stuff, they want to try to get like that Americana stuff.
Yeah.
So there's always this nostalgia aspect to horror games, and instead this was like Taiwanese nostalgia built into this horror game. And the thing it was just really, really neat playing it. I will say the one thing, the game really hinges on its story because the gameplay is like pretty light as far as puzzle solving and stuff. The story and where it goes is so interesting because it's told. There's a point in the game where you can actually go to the department in the three separate. You are given the ability to go between the three different time periods when you want, and you're kind of trading items between them to kind of solve the puzzles and that sort of thing. So what you're seeing is the story play out through three different eras, and you're trying to put the pieces together. And I do feel like sometimes with stories like that, where they're like, oh, we'll have like a trail of breadcrumbs and then it'll all come together at the end, or we'll just leave it mysterious and up to the player to figure out what actually happened. This one I think is like pretty clear about what's happening. Like you can figure out what happened. It's not like so mysterious. I like, okay, what happened in this game? Because with a game that has like its story told through three different time periods and like bits and pieces that you're picking up and like reading things and that kind of thing. It's like, it could just be a total mess, but it was like very clear what happens, in the story. And it's a very tragic story. It's not it's the emotions that are the horror aspect of it. It's not the story itself that's horrifying, which is really, really neat. And I just loved it. I thought it was like, it was like when people say it's like, oh, this is probably one of the best horror games ever. It's probably one of the best horror games ever. Yeah, it's super cool. And like, I hope it comes to PS4 and stuff. Like, I don't know.
I mean, if you have to go through all like the little hoops and it's not on like any of those PC platforms that I feel like are way more open than PSN or Xbox Live, like I feel like you're gonna struggle getting there.
Yeah, so it sucks that it was this game that got banned.
Yeah, of all the ones.
It definitely rises above the story of, oh, it's just that one game that got banned and that's why it got popular. It's like, yeah, that's true, but it was a super awesome game with amazing visuals, a really, really cool story, and probably some stuff you've never seen. So like, if you're willing to take the dive, like for other folks, like I would definitely recommend picking it up. You have to buy it directly from the site though. No other place has it. Yeah.
All right. Well, we are Workforce Gaming. You can follow us on Twitter at Workforce Gaming. Subscribe to us wherever you're listening, and we will see you later.
Bye.